Right, ladies and gentlemen, tonight it's the 5th in the series of 6 lectures, and I've got to say it's an absolute mystery. It's called The Mystery of Shedden Valley.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I call my talk The Mystery of the Shedden Valley, but to a large number of people the Shedden Valley itself is a mystery. Wherever is it? Because it was kept deliberately private and deliberately secret right up to the 1980s. Up to the 1950s it was kept private by the landed gentry protecting their sporting rights, and then when it was sold to the Burnley Corporation Water Department, following upon the policy of all the water authorities in those days, they deliberately tried to keep people away and keep the whole area private. So it's not surprising that a large number of people have no idea where the Shedden Valley is, and that is the purpose of my first slide. The Shedden Valley is roughly on the Worsthorne Moor here. You see, we have Burnley here and Sheddin Bridge, and the nearest village is the village of Worsthorne. Then you get Mereclough and of course Holme Chapel here. So I hope that you have a rough idea of the area. Now the Shedden Valley is a mysterious valley because it is hidden. If you take a motor ride along the Long Causeway, that is the old road that runs from Mereclough to Sheddin Bridge. If you drive along there in a car and you look across this expanse of moor, you look right across to Worsthorne Moor. There's level moor here and level moor there, and you appear to be a continuous moor across. But actually there is the defile of the Shedden Valley in between, and you look clean over the top of it and you don't know it's there. Now the actual Sheddin Valley is fed by the Sheddin Brook, and that rises at the summit of Black Hameldon. That's the hill on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border here. Now the very highest point is about 1,500 feet above sea level here, and the stream virtually rises at the higher point and runs down, and it runs in this southerly direction to begin with, and then it turns at an absolute right angle and proceeds along parallel to the Long Causeway. It runs along and eventually receives the Cantlough Beck coming out of Cantlough Reservoir, and then having joined the Cantlough Beck it becomes the Rock Water running through to Hurstwood, and then it becomes the River Brun and runs down into Burnley. But it's this portion here that we're interested in tonight. So if you will just take a note of the Long Causeway, this feature here that goes round in a bend. The ancient Long Causeway used to go down into a valley and up again, which was a very difficult part to negotiate for wagons, horse wagons, so a turnpike road was taken round there with a toll bar house in the centre. Now, further in his shooting interests, Sir John Thursby did a lot of work in this area, and he brought a high-powered head gamekeeper down from Scotland, and he built a miniature gentleman's residence for him on the Long Causeway here, and that is called Causeway House. So we've got Causeway House here on the Long Causeway, and we've got Cantlough Reservoir across on the moor, and in between we have this Shedden Valley. Now in 1947 I came to live at Middle Pasture Farm here at the foot of the Shedden Valley. Here here we have where the Shedden Beck is coming down and joins the Cantclough Beck at the water meetings and then runs into the Hurstwood Rock Glen. And I bought Middle Pasture Farm here in 1947 and I've lived there ever since. Well, of course, I'm always, one of my hobbies is exploring the countryside, and I couldn't, I was most impatient to go off further up the valley to see what it was like. Of course, the first thing I had to do was to have a look at some maps. And I looked at various editions of the Ordnance Survey map, and each edition seemed to tell a different story. It appeared that this Shedden Valley was nothing like what nature had intended it to be. It was a valley that had been altered out of all recognition by various activities of man. So I'm going to first of all tabulate 3 of those activities. This isn't the mystery that it is the title of the talk. The mystery will unfold itself when I've described these 3 activities that altered the shape of the valley from 1800 onward. Now, you might find this map rather difficult to read, so take my word for it. We have the Long Causeway here, so the Sheddon stream is parallel to it. And this was the first edition of the Ordnance Survey map, and this recorded a scene in the Shedden Valley of enclosures. Originally, the whole of the moor, Worsthorne Moor and Cliviger Moor, had been wide open common land for the inhabitants of Cliviger and Worsthorne to use in the summer months. But in 1804 there was an enclosure award for the Cliviger portion, and the Cliviger portion is on the south side of this stream and the Worsthorne portion is on the north side. Now in 1804, an enclosure award was granted by the Lords of Clitheroe to the freeholders of Cliviger, and that was to enclose the whole of the Cliviger moor. It was allocated out in parcels to the principal freeholders, and they could then use it for their own private purposes, and the words enclosure and improvement were thought to go hand in hand. The first thing was to enclose, and then it was to improve. So an elaborate system of pastures was planned, and the various freeholders, it was their obligation then to wall in these pastures. They were given 7 years in which to do it. If they didn't do it within 7 years, the land reverted to the lord of the manor. So this map, take my word for it, it shows the Cliviger portion completely divided up into individual fields by supposedly stone walls, whereas the Worsthorne portion is still open common land. So we had this first phase of hectic wall building in the Cliviger half of the valley. So and the purpose of this enclosure and improvement was for the purpose of hill sheep. This was in 1804. The Napoleonic Wars were on, and there was a tremendous demand for wool, for the uniforms for the soldiers, and also tremendous demand for food to feed the people, because there were certain blockades of the channel, and the similar to what we had in 2 world wars much later on. So there was a tremendous impetus to develop. There was no such thing as bad land. All land could be improved and made into good land. So there was this impetus to develop the Cliviger moor into sheep walks for a burgeoning sheep industry. Now, in order to do that, you got this wonderful system of stone walls built. This is the Shedden Valley coming down from the summit of Black Hambledon towards where it turns at right angles. And the Townleys were by far and away the largest freeholders in Cliviger, so they got the lion's share of this land, and they were sufficiently wealthy to put out to tender all the building of the stone walls. In 1811 there was an advert put into the Blackburn Advertiser calling for contractors to take on this work. It specified the height of the wall, the width of the wall, and presumably contractors took on the job, and all these walls were built, dividing the Cliviger moor into sheep walks. But in order to serve, here again we see the what fine walls they were, almost 6 feet high, and these were the old boundary stones. In between, on this side, it is the Worsthorne moor unenclosed, and on that side it is the Cliviger moor completely enclosed by all this crisscrossing stone walls. Now, in order to carry on the industry of sheep farming, certain facilities were required, and these facilities were provided. This was one for washing the sheep. This is all that remains of it today. It did actually stretch up here across there, and it would have been a big enough pen to hold about 1,000 sheep. So all the farmers who were running sheep and on the Cliviger enclosures would cooperate together and gather them all in and drive them into this enclosure. Here is the Sheddin Brook. A jetty was made alongside, and a dam would be thrown across here so that you would get a back flow of water some 4 or 5 feet deep, running back perhaps for some 50 yards. And then the process started with the men here, men inside catching the sheep, pushing them through there to a man here who would drop them down into the stream, and the sheep would then try and scramble out, but you had men on this side and men on that side and dogs, so that the sheep were compelled to swim all the way up the river until they waded out and escaped back onto the moor. The purpose of this was because the early sheep wool processing industry in Bradford could not deal with dirty wool. Wool had to be clean. Now you can send your wool straight from the sheep to Bradford, and it is scoured there and cleaned, but in those days they would not accept wool that hadn't been washed. So the first washing had to be done as you see here, in the Sheddin Brook. This was another sheep washing station higher up. It's fallen into much greater ruin, but in many ways it's more elaborate than that one, because it contained lots of little pens, because at the sheep gathering time you always found sheep that needed individual attention, so any that needed individual attention were picked out and just held in a little pen for whatever doctoring was required. And there'd also obviously been a roofed over shelter for the shepherds. This one was much higher up in the bleaker part of the moorland. The stream again would be dammed, and there was a narrow, instead of just a gap in a wall, there was a narrow passageway down to the stream, so that the sheep would be pushed into this passageway and then pressed on by sheep behind them. They eventually fell over into the stream and had to swim because of the men and dogs forcing them to swim up the river. This is another view of that same, this is the main holding pen. and you got little smaller pens here, and you can just see that narrow passageway there that took them down to the stream. Another feature that had to be provided, once Cliviger Moor was enclosed, previously it had been a right of way for the drovers and pack horse trains that were travelling along the unenclosed land. They did that because there was no impediment to travel, and also they could graze their animals on the moorland as they went. But coming up against a stone wall was a problem, and of course they had a right of way, so a drove road was put right through the Cliviger enclosures, and it was specified that it should be 33 feet wide. That was to enable considerable droves of cattle to be driven along it. Here is the Cliviger enclosure wall. There was a gate here, so that when the drovers or pack horse trains arrived at this wall, they could go through the gate and have their own road right through without interfering with the flocks and herds on the privately enclosed land. That is another view of that first view was looking up the drove road. This is looking down it, and you see it is the full 33 feet width in most of it. Now, so that was the early period as shown by the Ordnance Survey maps. Then followed a second period, because the prosperity of the sheep industry only lasted into around about the 1870s. When the Americas and Australia was opened up, and when the steamship took over from the sailing ship, vast amounts of wool, lamb and mutton came in from these new territories, so that the prices fell, and it was no longer possible to make a living out of sheep farming on these rough moorlands, and the whole industry collapsed. The sheep were taken away, the walls were allowed to fall down and become derelict, and the new use for the area then was taken over by the sporting gentlemen. They wanted the land for shooting rights, and this gentleman in particular, Sir John Ormerod Scarlet Thursby, lived at Ormerod House at the foot of the Shedden Valley, and he bought the whole of the moors from the Townley family and any other landowners. He bought the whole of the lot and started a most ambitious scheme to develop it as a sporting estate, aping the greater gentry such as the Duke of Devonshire and those with the vast shooting estates in Scotland. He started to develop one of his own in the Shedden Valley. So this was the next phase of its history. This was his home, Ormerod House. It had originally been a small Elizabethan mansion of 2 bays, but the Thursbys had the whole of the wealth of the Burnley coalfield at their disposal, and developed this most elaborate mansion. Now, this was the state of affairs of the Shedden Valley from roughly 1904. You would recall that the first stage started in 1804 of the sheep enclosures. That lasted till about 1870. Then the Townleys just used the moors for haphazard shooting, but Sir John bought the whole area in 1904 and set about spending a great deal of money creating an elaborate sporting estate. This was, by the 1920s, it had got to this state. Here we have Ormerod House at the foot of the Shedden Valley, with all its demesne land here, with all the sporting facilities such as hockey pitch, tennis court, putting green, everything you could think of. And then he decided that this area here was going to be his shooting estate, and for that purpose he built a road. Foxstones Lane did exist here. It came to Foxstones there and then forward to Crow Halls, and that was roughly the extent of it. Just past Crow Halls it just ran out onto the open moor, but he continued this road up here to Middle Pasture Farm, where I live now, and then he took it down into the Shedden Valley. It went through a gate, which is the extent of my land, into the Shedden Valley. It wound down to the river. At the river he built a bridge over the river, and then he took a road straight up to a farm here which was called Shedden Farm. He then arranged for all this area from the junction with the Camp Clough Beck right up to where it did the right angle bend, almost up to the slopes of Black Hambledon. All this area was planted chock-a-block with trees, and then from here onwards you have these rectangular or straight-sided plantations with fire breaks in between. Now they were all planted after 1904. I spoke to one man who said his job was he got a shilling for planting 200, and he had to go along to Shedden farmhouse with a bag round his neck and get 200 small trees in the bag, go and plant them, then go back, and he got his shilling and then got another 200. And that's how the whole area was planted, with literally thousands of trees. In order to be able to operate the sporting estate, a number of under-game keepers required. As I've mentioned already, he got a Mr. Alexander Cole, a professional gamekeeper from Nairn in Scotland, and he built a gentleman's residence from him here, and he was the head gamekeeper. And he had under gamekeepers at Shedden Farmhouse and Shedden Farm Cottages. He had an under gamekeeper at Stippenden Bar here, and then he had various facilities at Foxstones Farm and at Brown Hill. They were mainly kennels and horse stables, but he had under gamekeepers there as well as certain under gamekeepers at home. So he had quite an army of gamekeepers all under the management of Mr. Cole. So that was developed into quite an active shooting estate, and all the farms on the way up, he'd bought those, so all the farmers were his tenants, and they had to keep this road in good condition, particularly as the August 12th approached. And Sir John was quite a 6 foot tall, very domineering sort of man, and he would ride up every day to make sure that everything was spick and span ready for August the 12th. And a man called Joe Collins, who I knew quite well when I came up here in 1947, he lived with his wife at Causeway House, and he told me that Sir John and Lady Thursby would ride up in a carriage and stop in front of their house, and Lady Thursby would go in to Mrs. Collins's open black leaded range, and he said she used to put her feet up on the range and sit there eating Mrs. Collins's home baking, and said that she'd never was as warm and as comfortable and had never enjoyed food as much, despite the magnificent house that she lived in with all its servants. And meanwhile, Sir John would take Jo across the moor to examine all the shooting boxes which it was Jo's responsibility to have ready for August 12th. Just as a little aside, Jo also told me a most amusing story. This happened in 1919, just after the First World War, and he was in the house here, and his wife suddenly came rushing in and said, "Quick, Jo, railway engines come off lines and it's bound to knock our house down." So Jo ran to the front door, and sure enough, coming along here was this railway engine, belching smoke and steam and clattering along. So he grabbed his wife and they ran out at the back door up onto the moor, and it went puffing by, and it was the very first Foden steam wagon to ever penetrate and climb up this hill. And of course, having climbed Wicked Hill here and then the other hills, the driver had got a terrific head of steam up. He was bringing a load of lime to some farms over there, and having got this steam, he had to use it, and he was belting along here at a great speed